Welcome. My name is Marie Ann, and I am your worship associate this morning. And it's so good to see everybody. And it seems that summer might be almost over because we're coming back. Please join me in saying these words as Jennifer lights the chalice. We light this chalice with the embers of compassion. We light this chalice with the torch of justice. We light this chalice with the radiance of joy. Katie.
Good morning. All right, I invite any children of all ages, young and old, if they'd like to come join us on the carpet. We have so many kids here today. That is fantastic. And all of you adults out there who would like to read a story for all ages soon, please come see me because there will be opportunities. I've been hogging the story for all ages, but I'm about ready to release it. All right, so here's our story for today. This story is called A Bargain for Francis, and it's by Russell Hoban and illustrated by Lillian Hoban. This is a story that is not about perfect people, okay? So I want you to use your thinking brains to think about this story. Once upon a time, there was a little badger named Francis. That's a badger, by the way, not a raccoon. One day, she said to her mother, "I'm going to play with Thelma and have a tea party." Her mother said, "All right, but be careful." And Francis said, "Why should I be careful at a tea party?" Her mother said, "Remember when you went sledding? Who came home cold and wet?" Thelma didn't, but I did. And her mother said, "And when you played boomerang, who got a bump on her head?" Thelma didn't, but I did. "Yes," said her mother, "so be careful." So Frances packed up her toys and went to Thelma's house. They played with Thelma's tea set. Frances said, "I'm saving up to buy a real china tea set with blue flowers. I have $2.17. And Thelma said, "Oh, the blue ones are no good. China breaks. This is plastic and has red roses on it and is much better. Besides, the china ones are very expensive and you will never have enough money for them. Plus, you can't even find them anymore." That made Frances nervous and sad. And then Thelma said, "But I will sell you mine for $2.15 because you're my friend." Wow, thought Frances, that is so nice of Thelma. So she ran home and got her money and went back and gave her the money and left with the plastic tea set. "No backsies," called Thelma, and "no backsies," called Frances. The next day, Frances and her little sister were playing, and Frances pulled out the tea set. "Where did you get that?" said her sister. And she said, "From Thelma." Her sister said, "Oh, it isn't as nice as the real china ones with the blue flowers that you wanted." "No," said Frances, "but it was only $2.15, and Thelma said you can't even get the real china ones anymore." "Well," said her little sister, "I saw her at the drugstore yesterday evening, and she was looking at a real china blue one, and it was only $2.15, and she bought it." Right? That doesn't sound very good. So Frances didn't feel very good anymore. But then she got a plan. She put one of her leftover pennies, remember she had two, into the sugar bowl. And she called Thelma. "Hey, Thelma, you said no backsies, right?" "Right," said Thelma, "no backsies." "Well, I just want to make sure, because there is something in the sugar bowl, and I want to make sure you don't mind if I keep it." "Wait, what? What is it?" said Thelma. "What is it?" "Well, it's mine. And you said no backsies." "Wait," said Thelma. "I might have some money in there. I think I did." "Well," said Frances, "it might be money." "Yes," said Thelma, "I am sure I had money in there now. I would like that back." "Well," said Frances, "you said no backsies." "Well, we can do backsies," said Frances, "but only if you want." "Yes," said Thelma, "I want to do backsies, but I don't have your money. I got a new tea set. But I suppose it would be better to have my old tea set and all that money than this new one." "Okay," said Frances, "I'm coming over." Well, when she got to Thelma's, they put their tea sets down. "Backsies?" "Yes, backsies," they agreed. So there she goes. And Thelma said, she lifted the lid off the sugar bowl, and there was only that 1 penny inside. "That's not very nice of you," said Thelma. "You tricked me. I should be careful with you." And Frances said, "You tricked me when you sold me your tea set because you knew you wanted that new one. So I think I want to ask you, would you rather be careful or would you rather be friends? Because I would like to be friends and not trick each other and have to be careful." "Okay," said Thelma, "I would rather be friends than be careful." So they went together to spend that last penny. And the other one that Frances had too, on a little bag of candy, which they then ate together and shared with Frances's little sister. The end. All right.
Yay.
So with that, we're going to sing the children upstairs. So if we could
Yes,
form a bridge,
let's make a
that would
bridge.
be great.
All right. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go.
Our opening words today are by Eckhart Tolle. Whenever you are able, have a look inside yourself to see whether you are unconsciously creating conflict between the inner and the outer, between your external circumstances at the moment, where you are, who you are with, or what you are doing, and your thoughts and feelings. Can you feel how painful it is to internally stand in opposition to what is? When you recognize this, you also realize that you are now free to give up this futile conflict, this inner state of war.
Please join me in this responsive reading. In dwelling, live close to the ground.
Peace is the answer.
In thinking, keep to the simple.
Calm is the answer.
In conflict, be fair and generous.
Justice is the answer.
In governing, don't try to control.
Compassion is the answer.
In work, do what you enjoy.
Joy is the answer.
In family life, be completely present.
Love is the answer.
Love is the answer. Today we're going to talk about sometimes what some people say to be quite the opposite of love, and that is the presence of conflict. And oftentimes when we think of this word conflict, we immediately go to interpersonal conflict. But I would like to suggest that that interpersonal conflict could actually ripple out into a larger context, in that there's also this thing called systemic conflict, for example. How many of you have heard of this whole dynamic called the family systems theory? There was a guy by the name of Edwin Friedman who proposed that these family systems are actually transmitted from generation to generation, that we have been all born into environments where we deal with conflict in certain styles and we deal with conflict in certain ways because that's the environment we grew up in. And in terms of the larger society, and church, for example, is a whole family system onto itself. And churches never have conflicts within itself, right? Of course not. That's why we don't need no stinking mission ministry team, because we're all perfect just the way we are. And so, as we go larger and larger, we see that even in our own society, there's conflict. Anybody ever hear what's going on in Washington, D.C. recently? And if you haven't, there's going to be a great dinner tonight with the Interfaith Alliance, and Welton Gaddy, the former president of the Interfaith Alliance, will talk to you about the current toxic environment in Congress right now in Washington, D.C., as if you already didn't know about it, right? So there's that level of conflict. And nation among nations, this is the reason why we've had at least 2 world wars, And not to mention the Cold War after that. And, it seems so cyclical these days. Are we enemies with Russia again or what? And so there's the international conflict. And if we go even beyond that, there's something called intergalactical conflict, right? Star Wars. So we don't all necessarily just live long and prosper, but there's moments and opportunities where we rub up against those nasty Klingons, and they get on our nerves because they're just not playing fair and they're not playing according to Federation rules, right? And so, and if we pull back down even to the itty tiny bit, there's also what I call intrapersonal conflict. That every moment, even within ourselves, we fight what's going on between us or inside of us, right? So there's this devil on the left hand shoulder and the angel on the right hand, and they're constantly bickering with each other. I don't know if you've heard the voices in my head or not, but usually the conversation goes something like, no, you shall not have a second dessert because that will only up your cholesterol level and get you even fatter than you already are. So don't do it. But yet there's the other one of, oh, it's so yummy. It's so sweet. If it feels and tastes so good, how could it be wrong? So even the intrapersonal conflict that takes place in our lives on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to be talking today mostly about the good, and really for the next 3 weeks, about the good, the bad, and the uncertain when it comes to conflict. Now we'll begin with the bad. And the bad, when we talk about conflict, there's usually all these negative images that come to our mind. Let's just say that for most of us, whenever conflict arises, we're not our best selves. And our faces are not the happiest smiley faces that we notice in the world, yeah? And so the first tendency, I think, is for us to avoid conflict, right? Like this ostrich over here, that we avoid conflict because, gosh darn it, we want to be loved. Aren't we the nicest people in the world? We're Unitarian Universalists. We're the happy, preppy people, right? It's like that Vitamina Vegemin ad from I Love Lucy. Talk about happy, preppy people. And that's who we are, because we have a positive theology, and we're not supposed to rock the boat, right? So it's easier just to avoid conflict entirely. And admittedly, part of this is also cultural, believe it or not. Chris's best friend is Japanese, and her husband is also Japanese. And in that household, I have never, not once, witnessed them fight or have a disagreement or have a conflict ever. And I thought about my own family. We're Chinese. We don't believe in this whole passive-aggressive thing. We just believe that aggressive is the way to go. Okay? And so very different style when it comes to whether to engage in conflict or not. But oftentimes, people who want to be loved, who want to be nice, who want to appear to be people pleasers, will go with the conflict avoidant route. And today, there's actually 3 major ways that people try to avoid conflict. I call these the animal strategies. And what do I mean by the animal strategies? Well, one of them I just mentioned. Notice this ostrich over here who has her head buried in the sand, right? So one way to avoid conflict is to simply ignore it. If I stick my head under the sand, I'll pretend like the world doesn't exist. It's just pitch dark black here, right? That's all there is to it. The second way, the second animal approach is ignore that elephant in the middle of the room and try to diverge your attention away from it. Talk about everything else. Talk about the weather. Ooh, or how about that bird over there? Or this, that, and the other. Just don't look at that big old elephant sitting there in the middle of the room. The third animal way of avoiding conflict is what I call the turtle shell. So like a turtle, stick your head back in your shell and just shut down completely. Protect yourself from having to deal with the messiness that conflict sometimes comes with. And I must say, it probably isn't all that bad, because think about it. Don't you ever wish sometimes that time would heal all wounds, as they say, and if you just ignore it and divert your attention from it far enough, I mean, come on, I don't even have time to deal with this conflict right now anyway. So I'm going to put it on the back burner for now and let it resolve itself. And I'd say that methodology probably works 0.1% of the time. I noticed, for example, that if I just ignore a certain email chain for a while, that when I come back to it a week later, perhaps the people who are involved in that conflict will be able to resolve it amongst themselves. But more often than not, I find that that actually doesn't work. So, what are some other thou shalt not? So, according to the world, according to Reverend Jennifer, the first of 3 commandments of thou shalt not is thou shalt not avoid a conflict. The second one, can you take a wild guess as to what it is? You can cheat if you need to and look up on the screen. Thou shalt not create conflict. So that's on the other end of the spectrum. So these are folks that I would consider to be, what's that French word? I'm going to use a fancy French word here. Provocateur. Those who provoke you to be angry or to provoke you to pick a fight, right? Or instigators are sometimes what they're called. And contrarians. Whenever you say something, they'll say the opposite. Even though they do believe the opposite, or they do believe what you're saying is true, they're going to say the opposite anyway, just to piss you off, right? And sometimes, once in a while, we also lovingly call these people drama queens. They're just drawn to drama like flies to that stinky stuff that I won't repeat because we can't air it on our website if I cuss and FAA regulations and all that. Or is it FCC? I'm sorry, FAA is the airplane thing, right? Yeah. So, although I have a new mantra now too, of don't cuss and fly, right? So, according to FCC regulations, I can't say the other word, but you get what I'm saying, that some people are just drawn to conflict, and so they create it because they think that it gives them meaning in life or something like that. And again, I won't mention any names of who I think belongs to this category, but let's just say my better half sometimes has a tendency, wonderfully creative individual, right? And that's what he gets paid to do. Writer, okay, let me go. Before you think I'm picking on my dearly beloved husband here, back in 8th grade, I learned in my English class that in order to write a good story, what do you need? Conflict, right? Human against human, good versus evil, human against nature, human against themselves, human against the Klingons or all the other forces in the galaxy, right? So conflict is necessary in order to write a good book. And so sometimes people gravitate towards creating a nice, juicy story where there's conflict between characters. And so they tend to create drama and they tend to create conflict. And certainly, okay, this is when you're going to say that I'm really being fair here because I'm going to pick on myself too. So it's not just my better half that's drawn to conflict, but us religious folks have also incited conflict in the course of our history, right? That our history isn't necessarily devoid of conflict creation. In fact, when I Googled the words conflict creation, it went back to religious conflicts. What do I mean by this? Anybody ever heard of this thing called the Crusades back in the Middle Ages, right? It seems like almost 100 years or so, the Pope would send a bunch of people to conquer Jerusalem and bring them back from the infidels. So these days, how can we blame the Muslim world and ISIS for being pissed off at the Western world and for being pissed off at Christians and wanting to reclaim the world back from the infidels, right? So this whole religious conflict just keeps going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Sometimes we don't even know when it got started to begin with, right? I mean, who knows how Northern Ireland got into this fight between the Protestants and the Catholics. And it was just within my lifetime that that conflict has abated somewhat. And so, as we can see, conflict creation is present in many situations. But here's my question to you. Do you really think that conflict creation is necessarily bad? For Unitarian Universalists, for example, we ought to be maladjusted and malcontent when it comes to injustice, right? So isn't it our responsibility to cause holy mischief, to bring trouble into our world, to stir the waters and stir the pot, to make sure that we never grow complacent, we never grow uncomfortable when poor people are being oppressed, when people are being bullied in schools? We should never be comfortable with that, and we should create conflict within our justice system, within the wider community, in order for justice to be brought about. So it's not as clean cut as we may think, this second commandment of thou shalt not create conflict. So what's the third one? Thou shalt not perpetuate conflict. In other words, unlike the Germans back when, during the Reformation era, don't have a 30-year war over fighting over religious beliefs, because more and more people are just going to die because of that, and it's just going to create a very toxic situation. And ironically enough, this whole third commandment about perpetuation can either stem from avoiding conflict or creating it. You notice that? That both of them could feed into a perpetuation of conflict. Let me tell you another story from another English class. I seem to be having lots of problems with English, don't I? So this time around, sophomore year in high school. And I can't really remember what originated this conflict. All I know is that by the end of the first quarter of my English class, I had waged a full-on war with my teacher. And I tell you, I was not my best self at all. When we would be looking through our Wordly Wise book, as it was called, I'd pick out certain words like bereft, and when asked to use it in a sentence, I would say stuff like, your daughter is bereft to have you as a mother. And yeah, I know, mean, evil, cruel stuff. Yeah, I'm ashamed of it. And admittedly, this is one of those opportunities when the minister preaches a sermon, it's kind of like, don't go ye therefore and do likewise, all right? In fact, go ye therefore and do the opposite of what I did. But I don't know where it came from. And looking back, the only thing I could think of is maybe that she had the audacity to give me an A- in yearbook class, which I was also taking with her, you know, and that did not sit very well with me. I mean, never mind the fact that in high school, an A- is still a 4.0 anyway, yeah? But that did not sit well with me, and so we had this conflict going on. And guess who suffered more in that situation, right? I did. Yeah, I was harboring all this anger and resentment towards her, and I was coming up with all these schemes as to how to get her fired after that year. And in fact, I had written a letter to the superintendent of the district, and I was determined. Until one day, the principal called me into her office. And finally, we had a good chat. And finally, I was at the point where I was like a volcano just simmering and boiling with all this lava and hot stuff brewing inside of me. Right about to explode, I got called into the principal's office. And we had a moment there when I had to confront my innermost demons, so to speak, and reasons why I was perpetuating this conflict with my high school teacher. And that's when I realized, you know what sophomore means? It means wise fool. So I was being a fool, and yet there was wisdom to be drawn from that experience. And it didn't take me until 2 years later. So it was really a 3-year conflict that I waged with her in another English class when we had to write a letter of apology to someone. And I thought about her. And I did write a letter to her. And by that time, she had already left the school. But at the same point, yeah, I guess my campaign to get her fired worked. And I'm so sorry, by the way, if you're listening out there. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. Finally, at that point, was when I got my peace back because I decided I no longer wanted to perpetuate this conflict. So the 3 thou shalt nots I'm sharing with you, not to shoot on you and not to tell you what to do, because I know that's not going to work anyway. As Unitarian Universalists, you're going to do whatever the hell you want anyway, no matter what I say, right? But just to say that, hopefully there could be some lessons learned from my mistakes. And hopefully for the next 2 more weeks, after we talked about the bad, now that we got the bad out of the way, we're going to be talking about some strategies, some techniques, some of the good that could actually come out of a conflict, all right? So hang in there. I know, too, that most of you are sitting here thinking, this is going to be really useful for me, because how many of you have never, ever experienced a conflict in your life before? Because if you haven't, I'll pick one with you right now, right? I'll pick a So most of us have. So conflict just is. It's a matter of reality. It pervades our everyday life. The question is, can we be conflict fluent? Can we figure out ways to engage in conflict so that we're intentional about it and so that we're effective in dealing with conflict? And in order to do that, you're just going to have to come back next week. What's that line from Dolly Parton after the end of The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas? Y'all come back now, you hear? So tune in next week for our next version of Conflict Transformation 101. May it be so.